Good evening. Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the 2015 Earthwatch debate, Climate Change in Britain. My name is Steve Gray, and earlier this month, I was proud to step into the role of Chief Executive of Earthwatch Europe. As we will hear this evening, through the stimulating and passionate discussion that will follow, the need for the work of Earthwatch, engaging people in science, inspiring them through hands-on experiences, and increasing understanding of complex issues to promote sustainable action has never been greater. The 2030 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals highlight the need for people from all walks of life to be actively engaged in environmental solutions, and the important role of partnerships working across sectors in helping that happen. In many ways, Earthwatch has been a pioneer in both these areas. Before I introduce the chair for our evening, please forgive one or two announcements. Firstly, it is important to note we are not expecting a fire drill this evening. If you do hear an alarm, please make your way to the nearest exit, which are located on this side of the auditorium and at the back of the theatre. Our staff will be on hand to show you the way. I also thank you for ensuring your mobiles are switched off and remind you there will be a specific section of the evening for your questions. So please remember them and keep them for that section. We have a great mix of Earthwatch volunteers, supporters, and partners in the audience tonight, and I know many of you have personal experience of our mission to engage people worldwide in scientific field research and education to promote the understanding and action necessary for a sustainable environment. And tonight, I am delighted to announce that to help share the outcomes of our work across the UK and Europe specifically, we are launching a new regional Twitter account. So please follow us and share with your friends and organisations, after you've turned your phones back on at the end of the evening, that is, as this will be a great place to keep up to date with our projects and our partnerships and become an active part of the Earthwatch Europe community. And tonight, we will be tweeting about the debate using the hashtag #EarthwatchClimate. I would like to offer huge thanks to our sponsors for this evening, Julie Rogers and her team from the Mitsubishi Corporation Fund for Europe and Africa. Without your support, over many years, our lectures and debates would simply not be possible. We are very grateful. I would also like to personally thank the Earthwatch team who have worked very hard indeed to put this evening together. Thank you. And so I have the great pleasure of introducing our chair for this evening's debate. Tony is a campaigner, writer, sustainability advisor, and well-known British environmentalist. For 30 years, he has worked towards creating a more sustainable society, locally, nationally, and internationally. From providing ecology and conservation experiences for primary school children, making the case for new recycling laws, he has worked for change at many levels. Tony is also expert, as many of you will have read, in helping us understand what nature does for Britain. Thank you for being with us tonight, Tony, and without further delay, I will hand over to you to explain tonight's proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve. It's an absolute pleasure to be here this evening and to have the privilege of chairing this Earthwatch annual debate. I don't think there are many people who've not heard about climate change these days, and at first glance it might seem like a reasonably simple concept, certainly a very short phrase. But anyone who delves into this for any length of time soon realizes that it is riven with complexity, both in depth and in breadth. There's no doubt in my mind, and I'm sure many people who spend the time to study this subject, that the implications of climate change are indeed profound and perhaps represent the greatest challenge facing humankind as we go into the following decades of the 21st century. But as we face that challenge, perhaps it is that very complexity that we find ourselves paralyzed in the face of as we try to forge solutions. The complexity operates at many different levels. One is at the level of the basic physical science. How much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are going to change the climate in ways that might cause problems? What will be the role of feedbacks? Is 2 degrees really a safe level of temperature increase that we should entertain? Massive complexity in the political and policy side. What should governments do? Should they set a carbon price? Should they favour technologies? Or should they leave the solutions to the market? Questions of global equity instantly come onto the agenda. Who should be cutting emissions, by what level, by what timetable, and who should pay? What is the responsibility of the historic polluters in coming forward with leadership actions, recognising that some countries have contributed very little to the problem? A range of technology choices. Should we be ramping up solar power, or should we be going hell for leather for nuclear? What should be the role of energy efficiency as we look at technology choices? And then there are matters of scale and where we should be intervening with what kinds of tools. Should that be at the nation-state level? Is that where leadership should be? Or should it be at cities? Or indeed with individual citizens? Or in fact private sector corporations? Where should the pendulum swing next in bringing forward solutions? And then we find the challenge of climate change inextricably linked with the health of ecosystems and so-called carbon sinks, whether they be tropical rainforests, salt marshes, or peatlands, all of which are under tremendous pressure across the world. Then on to the top of that, we can add questions of adaptation and what is going to be the most effective ways in which we might be able to avoid the worst, heaviest blows that come from this. And you can see that we have a great many issues on the table all at once. Add to that the matter of communications and how we might best talk about this. Is it best to frighten people or to give them hope? Is it best to seek to inspire them or to give them statistics? These are really important questions too. Roll all of that together and add in a few other things as well, and you realize this is not simple. And that's why we're having this evening's debate. Because if we are going to be able to deal with climate change, we're going to have to identify some priorities. This is not an easy thing to do, but choices are on the table and we need to select them carefully, including here in the UK. This evening's discussion is going to be fascinating and illuminating, and it really is here to provoke you to be thinking about where you would put your choices in taking forward an effective programme on climate change. And to enable us to do that, and to get to the point where we'll be making some decisions later on, we have 4 excellent speakers. I will introduce them one by one. At the end of their particular priority, we will be coming back for a panel conversation, opening to the floor for questions from all of you, and then we're going to be asking you all to vote on what you think is going to be the most effective means to be able to deal with that complexity, so that when we look at climate change in the future, it will be something that we solved rather than something that is an existential threat for our civilization. For those people not in the room, watching on live streaming, please do tweet your questions, #EWClimate, and that will get you into the debate later on, and we'll be reading out some of those questions to augment the conversation going on right here. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dimitri Zengelis. He is going to tell us some of his views around the need for carbon pricing. He's Joint Head of Policy at the Grantham Research Institution at the London School of Economics, and recently headed the economics of the Global Commission, headed the economics for the Global Commission of the Economy and Climate Change, supporting paper on greenhouse gas innovations. Recently co-authored a paper on equitable mitigation actions and approaches to 2030 ahead of the UN conference, which takes place in Paris at the end of next month and the beginning of December. Dimitri, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Stephen. Thanks to Earthwatch for inviting me here to talk today. So what I'm going to talk about in my 12 or so minutes is that I'm going to try and persuade you that we can be green and we can grow. And the reason we can be green and we can grow as a global and also as a UK economy is because of one word, and that's innovation. But innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum, and in particular, the right kind of innovation that we need to be green and grow will not happen unless we steer it and direct it. And that's going to be the main essence of what I'm about to say. Now, you may counter, why do we need growth at all? Isn't growth part of the problem? And indeed, decoupling amongst certain intractable sectors like nitrogen or potassium or water or biodiversity is a real problem. But it isn't a problem for carbon and climate. We can lick this, and we can lick it fairly easily. So if we can be green and grow, I would argue we should grow. It's not because I think people who are already materially wealthy should accumulate more material wealth. But it's difficult to talk to that half of the world that lives on around $2 a day and tell them that they don't or shouldn't have an opportunity to grow. For them, growth is a means out of poverty. It's a means back into social inclusion. And growth actually correlates with a lot of things we like, from health and education, scientific attainment, security, tolerance, equal opportunities. So I would argue that if we can be green and grow, we should. And even for rich countries, I mean, tell me a government that's ever lasted an entire term on the platform of zero growth. It just isn't politically feasible. So if we can solve this problem whilst continuing to grow, I think that's something we should take very seriously. Ooh, get rid of that mugshot. Right. And the problem sort of can be summed up to some extent through the old sort of Malthusian issue. 200 years ago, Thomas Malthus predicted that there would be certain constraints to growth. We are now 80 times, not 80%, 80 times richer than we were at that point. And yes, constraints are mounting, but the main thing he missed was that we have become much better at getting more out of the resources we have through innovation. What he forgot, if you like, is that every mouth is born with a brain. And knowledge is weightless. It's not only weightless, it's infinite. It breeds off itself. Unlike material resources which get run down as you use them, knowledge does the opposite. If you invest in computers, people think of smart ideas to use them, which means they develop software, which means people tend to invest in faster computers and so on. So innovation tends to build on innovation, and it's epitomized by the Newtonian quip that innovators see further by standing on the shoulders of giants. And that's right, but it is also a source of a problem, because if you think about that, that means that we are to some extent at least slaves to history. We have locked into not just technological, but all sorts of infrastructural, network, mindset, and institutional ideas that we're going to have to shift if we're going to transform the economy towards resource and climate sustainability. The most obvious sense is shown by this picture. We have an existing infrastructural network that is fossil fuel based. We have mines, we have platforms, we have refineries, we have pipelines, we have ports, we have power stations, we have grids, and so on. Those networks have already been sunk as a cost. They will be used. So we have an infrastructural problem if we're going to try and disentangle ourselves from a carbon-intensive world. But it's not just infrastructure, it's not just networks, it's ideas. And we all know about the QWERTY keyboard. It was not invented to promote productive typing. It was invented to prevent keys from jamming in the old mechanical days. It's an open question whether you can do better than the QWERTY keyboard, but either way, we are stuck with it, irrespective of whether you value it. Bricks and mortar, we were here gathered in London, and yet London is very much determined in shape and form by decisions made 2,000 years ago by Romans. The shape of some of the buildings in the city of London are determined by the fact that they need to be wider, the gherkin being perhaps most famous, the walkie-talkie, another one, at the top than at the bottom to accommodate trading room floors. In fact, a lot of buildings have moved entirely to Canary Wharf, which is much more friendly for trading room floors, because the road plan the Romans left us was just too small. Mind the gap. That's a picture of a bikini taken in Ipanema Beach in Rio de Janeiro. It's a fashion outlet that is spawned by this iconic mind the gap icon that people relate to London. Why? Because lots of the tube stations are curved, so the trains don't align properly with the platform. So there's an announcement saying mind the gap. Again, you may not know this, but the Romans are responsible for that, because when they built the tube, they followed public roads. They didn't want to pay rent to private landowners. And so the public roads, which the Romans some characteristically, given their reputation, built were actually quite bent, and so therefore, so are the tube stations. 2,000 years ago, decisions made then had an impact on our financial and fashion industries today. But it's not just bricks and mortar, as I've said already, it's also ideas. You go to Copenhagen, you go to Amsterdam, and you see that everybody cycles, and you're sort of wide-eyed, and you're prompted to ask, why does everybody cycle? And they look at you with a degree of pride, and they tell you, well, everybody cycles here because we have such fine cycling infrastructure. Okay, you respond, that's great. How did you get this fantastic cycling infrastructure? And they look at you as if you're a bit of an idiot, and they go, well, everybody here cycles. And you're left kind of puzzling, thinking, well, hang on a minute, there's clear circularity, there's a chicken and egg. That doesn't matter. The point is that once you've got the institutions and the infrastructure, the ideas tend to follow. If you're a mayor standing on a platform of cycle lanes and pedestrianization in a sprawling suburban city like Atlanta or Minnesota, your tenure is probably measurable in weeks, right? In cities which are dense and which have these opportunities, actually politicians are held accountable for delivering those kinds of infrastructure. So it's about ideas as well. And it's also about institutions. We have this massive fossil fuel companies. They can pay good salaries to the best graduate students to think of ever more incredibly clever ways to access fossil fuels from remote locations. They have a head start from their infrastructure. They also lobby politicians very well because they've been doing it for years. And if we're going to try and impart change, we have to be aware of the fact that the losers from any change, they know exactly who they are, they know exactly how much they're going to lose, and they know which politicians' ears to bend in order to try and prevent that change. The beneficiaries, by contrast, are very diffuse. They're all of us. They're people that haven't even been born yet. They don't quite get to lobby politicians in the same way that the vested interests, the lobbies, the incumbents do. So in a sense, you've actually got kind of, inverting Newton's quip, you've actually got giants standing on the shoulders of innovators and steering innovation in a direction that is in line with historical innovation. So the bottom line of this part of the talk is that every stage of innovation, and by innovation I'm using the term very broadly, I don't just mean technologies and widgets, I mean behaviors, I mean institutions, I mean processes. Every stage of innovation in human development is path dependent. And that's a problem if the path we're on is one that we want to change, which is what we want to do if we want to build a sustainable economy. So how do we change that path? And the answer to that question is both simple and perplexing and taxing. We have to convincingly change expectations. And changing expectations, as you'd expect, is very much a behavioral, psychological thing. What do I mean by that? Imagine you're a political leader or a business leader or a mayor, and you understand the need to go green. And you say, look, I get it, but none of my competitors are going green. It's going to cost a lot because the technologies are expensive. The finance is expensive. And frankly, there isn't even a market for this stuff anyway. You know what? I'm going to wait. And everybody plays a collective waiting game and nothing happens. I don't think that's too far as a characterization of the situation we're in today. Now imagine one big player moves, or two big players move. China and the US, or the EU, or there's a breakthrough in storage technology, something that shifts expectations so that people believe, for whatever reason, they suddenly believe this is going to happen, then everything changes. The technology cost can be expected to fall because as you learn from experience of deploying and innovating technologies, their costs fall. We've seen solar PV costs fall by 5-fold in as many years because of the massive expansion in that sector. Similar stories for wind. The financing costs are going to fall because this is no longer a niche market, it becomes mainstream. And suddenly you've got massive new export markets. You will suddenly think, whether you're a business leader, a mayor, or a politician, that if you don't move quickly, your competitors are going to steal a march on you, you're going to lose out. The dynamics change. Note, it doesn't have to be any change in the real world. All the change that happened is in there. It's psychological. So how do we bring about this expectation that there'll be a change? Well, you need a really strong, credible policy set, you need cross-party support, and you need public support. And until you get that mix, it's going to be very difficult to make the change. And in the UK, we almost had that mix with the Climate Change Act, but we are in danger of jeopardizing it. Right now, we're getting very mixed muddled signals about the direction of climate change policy. And for investors, that means that they will demand higher returns, a higher risk premium from their investment, which makes the costs of going green higher, which of course means you're more likely to get opposition to it because it's more expensive, and which means that the policies are going to become less credible because people think they're too expensive. And very quickly, we may end up with people saying, well, look, this was all an awfully expensive mess. Let's ditch the Climate Change Act. there's some really nasty circular dynamics which we're in danger of getting trapped into. I've just got time, I think, for the economist jokes. There's two jokes here, and they both come at the expense of economists, and I'm happy to make them despite being one. The first joke is the IPCC, which uses so-called economic models to tell us that if we were to meet a 2-degree pathway, by 2100, we would need to dispose of about 2 to 12% of GDP. That's not a trivial amount in order to meet that pathway in 2100. Think about that for a moment. We're talking here about 85 years of investing and employing our best minds, our entrepreneurs, our innovators, to deliver a renewable world. And they're telling us that even by 2100, that, digging stuff up in far-flung remote places, ever more expensive places, putting them on boat, ships, and pipes, transporting them across the world, burning them, is going to be more expensive than getting energy from the air, from the sea, from the wind, and so on. They're not even allowing for the possibility that the latter could be cheaper. And by the way, I will buy that you'll have to invest to get there. But the idea that it's going to cost you something by that stage is ludicrous. And the reason they do that is because they have economic models which presuppose the cost of technologies, the structure of the economy in 2100. So they're actually answering the question they're supposed to answer. It reminds me of the economist joke, where you've got an engineer, a physicist, and an economist on a beach, and a tin of beans washed up, and they want to open it. And the physicist says, well, that's easy, I'll put it in the sun, mix of Boyle's law and Charles' law, it'll open up, and we'll eat the beans. The engineer says, no, hang on, why don't we use that coconut and the stick, and there's a fulcrum and a pivot, and we'll leverage it open, and we'll eat the beans. And they turn to the economist, they say, what would you do? The economist says, well, assume we had a tin opener. Okay, I'm glad you laugh, because I sometimes wonder whether you have to be an economist to get it. But that is exactly what's been done by the IPCC. The economists have assumed they know what the structure and the technologies and the behaviors of the economy will be in 2100, and they've told you the answer. It's absolutely ludicrous. I've got no time left, so my wrap-up slide simply says it's very difficult or impossible to predict the future, but we're actually perfectly capable of designing it. The challenge is not economical, it's not technological, it's cultural, institutional, and political. And therefore, we need complementary, credible policies that shift expectations. Which brings us to the vote. Now, we had a little bit of a discussion about this before, because I was going to play a bit of a spoiler. Obviously, I want to push for change. I want to push for something that shifts expectations. It's not about a green roof here or a solar panel there. I'm not actually going to argue in favor of voting for a carbon price, because a carbon price, if it's being applied at the same time as you're building sprawling cities and deforesting, your forest is useless. You need to have complementary policies. They all build on each other. They all complement each other. It's the conceit Bjorn Lomborg played when he started saying we can't afford to vote for climate, to invest in climate change, because we should be investing in AIDS or development or something else. No, actually, that's like saying don't invest in the roof of a house, or sorry, you should only invest in the roof of a house and not on walls and foundations, because the roof is better at keeping out the rain. You need all of them. So I suggest vote for spoiling the ballot papers. I was told that's probably not a good idea. So I just say, look, vote for whatever's going to push for change. Do it however you feel is most appropriate. You can do it through the ballot box. You can do it through, if you have your own business, change your behaviors, through exercising your consumer rights, or through protesting. They all make a difference. They're all important, but there's no silver bullet. So good luck to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Dimitri. A matter of belief and changing expectations. We're going to go straight to our next speaker in the form of Sarah Collenbrander. So Sarah is an environmental economist with the International Institute for Environment and Development. Her areas of expertise include climate change, urban development and governance, climate smart cities. She writes about these subjects, including a paper featured in The Guardian very recently. Sarah, you have the floor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here tonight. Before I start talking about climate smart cities, I'd like to take a second to say thank you to Dimitri. That was great. I support everything you say, but you don't know what priority means. Everything is a priority, but sometimes a first step is required, and the debate tonight should be about what that first step is. I'm going to argue for climate smart cities. I moved here to the UK 3 years ago, and life in Britain is not at all what I expected. Before moving here, I saw myself climbing over stiles in artistically muddied boots like Elizabeth Bennet, striding across the moors with fierce independence like Jane Eyre, challenging gender stereotypes and traipsing through the heather in a kilt like Rabbie Burns. Instead, the sprawling suburbs of London. You see, almost every English speaker in the world reads the great classics about rural life in Britain, and those who don't watch Downton Abbey. But life in the UK is no longer rural. 82% of the British population live in urban areas. So if we were to divide up the room here tonight, all of you would live in the cities and towns of Britain, and only this tiny fraction over here would live in the country with their sheep, or pigs if they're Tories. The point is, cities are the places where most economic and social activity takes place, where most of the institutions and infrastructure that Dimitri talked about are located, and therefore cities are the ultimate cause of most greenhouse gas emissions. Of global emissions from energy use, 71 to 76% can be attributed to urban areas, looking globally. There are no statistics for the UK, but if anything, it's probably higher. In other words, we need to transition to climate-smart cities if we're going to avoid dangerous levels of climate change. This is true all over the world. We need low-carbon development in the fast-growing cities of Africa and Asia. We need a low-carbon transformation in the sprawling suburbs of the US and Australia. But looking at Britain, specifically, considering that you all chose to spend your Thursday nights at this debate, I think you're in line with Tony's earlier comments and accept the scientific consensus on climate change. You might vote tonight to prioritise conserving biodiversity or enhancing carbon sinks, but if the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change suggests that we need climate-smart cities as well, you'd put that on the to-do list. It would be one of your priorities. It might seem like a simple thing, but this brings me a lot of joy. In Sydney, the first question from the audience is always, but what proof do you have that climate change is happening? To avoid these kind of debates at the start of every encounter, one resorts to extreme measures. I once bought a copy of the IPCC report to my dentist. But the thing about climate-smart cities is that even if you don't accept the overwhelming, unequivocal body of evidence, even if you don't accept all of the scientific research that climate change is happening, and I'm looking at you, Tony Abbott, Stephen Harper, Nigel Farage, we should still invest in climate-smart cities. Measures to reduce emissions from climate in cities offer huge benefits for society and the environment, above and beyond carbon savings. Climate-smart cities are cleaner, healthier, safer, quieter places to live. They're more economically productive, and they're more socially inclusive. This is obvious when we look at the transport sector. As anyone who has ever taken a road trip knows, driving in cities is incredibly fuel inefficient. It's all that stopping and starting. As a result, although only 20% of kilometres travelled by road transport in the UK take place in cities, that 20% of trips accounts for more like 40% of road transport emissions. But our dependence on private cars, on private vehicles, is causing much more than climate change. Over 30% of air pollutants in London come from private cars and freight. Congestion costs the UK £13 billion a year. And most importantly, and devastatingly, 730,000 people are injured or killed in road collisions every year. Britain needs to invest dramatically more in public transport and cycling lanes. Buses, bikes, and trains are far cheaper than private cars, both in terms of individual and in terms of total investment needs. This also means they're much more socially equitable. Unlike cars, public transport fosters human interaction, except in London, where we all spend our lives avoiding eye contact on the tube. And in addition, cities with good cycling infrastructure, Dimitri mentioned Copenhagen and Amsterdam, enjoy huge healthcare savings from increased physical activity, reduced air pollution, fewer road fatalities. Climate change is just one of many reasons that we should be investing in public transport and cycling lanes. Housing is another good example. The residential sector is responsible for 14% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions, mostly energy used for heating. Yet, in my experience, the heating doesn't work. I've been cold the entire time that I've lived here. Because of the poor quality of the housing stock, 1 out of every 5 households in the UK suffers from fuel poverty. They have to choose between heating and food for some months of the year. We should retrofit every one of those homes to the best possible standard, not because it will reduce our emissions, though that's important too, but because basic human decency demands that residents in a rich country like Britain shouldn't dread the winter months. We should absolutely make climate action a priority. But asthma, obesity, road accidents, pneumonia, and spiralling inequality are all priorities too. Investing in climate-smart cities will reduce our carbon footprint and make Britain a better place to live, particularly for the poorest among us. So tonight, the Earthwatch Institute is asking you to have your say. Should we focus on protecting biodiversity, as Mike will argue? The less the temperature rises, the smaller the impacts of climate change will be on ecosystems. To protect biodiversity, we need to invest in climate change mitigation. Should we focus on safeguarding climate sinks, as Martha will advocate? I would absolutely agree. If we were having this debate in Brazil or Indonesia or the Congo Basin. But in Britain, our forests and wetlands are just insignificant on the world stage. Beautiful, but insignificant. Should we focus on transforming the economy for a zero-carbon society? Well, that's pretty sweeping. It's kind of like saying vote for sustainability or vote against extinction. Everyone here believes we should take far-ranging and diverse action on climate change. This will require much more ambitious commitment from both the public and the private sector. And recently we have seen that both business and government can be an important source of finance and innovation and leadership. However, the last few years have also shown us that business and government cannot be relied upon to act independently for the global public good without oversight from civil society. The fossil fuel industry are the obvious villains, and they have driven changes in government policy in places like Canada and Australia. But now we're realizing that even climate leaders like the UK government will backpedal on green policies such as subsidies for renewables. And we're realizing that even green brands like Volkswagen will cheat the system with our emission test detecting software. If we're going to minimize climate change, it's clear we can't depend on the goodwill of the private or public sector. We need a vibrant, green civil society that holds government and business to account. We need people who will go to protests, buy sustainably certified products, write letters to their MP. We need people who will turn out their lights, choose to cycle to work and retrofit their homes. Everyone in the room agrees that there isn't going to be a silver bullet to solving climate change. Staying below the 2-degree threshold will require people to radically change the way we live and work and move. And for 82% of UK residents, those changes need to take place in urban areas. Climate-smart cities like Bristol, Freiburg, Vancouver, Bogota foster this kind of environmental culture. Good public transport normalizes sustainable behavior. Green public spaces build environmental awareness. Housing retrofit programs encourage green investment by households. Technological innovation and government action will only get us so far. The planet depends on people like us in cities like this choosing to live in a more sustainable way. So what can the government do? The government can make driving difficult. Cars are good for drivers, but they're not good for anyone else. They cause air pollution, noise pollution, carbon emissions, congestion, road accidents. The government should invest much more in cycle lanes and public transport and make sure that cars are the hardest and most expensive way to get around a city. And what can people like you and I do? Lots of things, everything. Eating vegetarian, composting, buying renewable electricity. But if we're prioritizing, let's invest in energy efficient homes. Get your windows triple glazed and your loft insulated. It's not very sexy, but it's important. If you own your own home, retrofit it. If you own somebody else's home, retrofit it. Make sure those of us who will never get on the property ladder are warm in the beds we don't own. Seriously, becoming a more sustainable and inclusive society requires us to care about the well-being of other people and other species. Dimitri's talked about transitioning to a zero-carbon society. Zero carbon? Where's your ambition? Zero poverty, zero air pollution. Climate-smart cities have a smaller carbon footprint, and that's why I'm here tonight. But climate-smart cities also have lower rates of poverty and better public health. And that's what we should be aiming for. Climate action that improves so much more than the climate.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. Some powerful messages there. I think for me, one of the strongest is the no regrets consequences of acting on climate change from the point of view of air pollution, more socially inclusive development, efficiency and everything else. In fact, you reminded me of a cartoon I once saw with a climate skeptic standing up at a climate conference, and the bit at the bottom said, if this proves to be not true, are we in danger of creating a better world for nothing? Kind of in the same spirit, I think. So we'll hang on to that thought. Right, my great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Martha Crockett. She's going to be speaking about carbon sinks. She's a research manager at Earthwatch Institute and a visiting research associate at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. She manages a research project based in Wytham Woods in Oxfordshire, which aims to understand how fragmented woodland can respond to climate change and the role that such forests may play in climate change adaptation and mitigation. And considering how all of our woodlands are fragmented, I dare say that's quite an important research project. Martha, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Tony, of course. And I have to start by saying it's inspiring seeing so many people who want to come out midweek. Don't know how far you've all travelled, but it's great seeing so many people here. So thank you to all of you as well. So, right here, I hope you can all see this. I'm holding a magical system that has the potential to significantly mitigate climate change. Plants, such as these ash tree seedlings, have the capacity to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They're a key component of our natural carbon cycles and in our battle against climate change. Straight away, I started using the C word. We hear a lot of talk about carbon footprints, carbon emissions, and so on, which can make us see carbon in a purely negative light and just related to global warming. It's actually the basis of all life on Earth. About 50% of the dry weight of all living organisms, that's you, this ash tree seedling, your cat, about 50% of the dry weight of all living organisms is carbon, and it's been the basic building material of life on Earth since well before humans evolved. Of course, it's not just in living organisms that carbon is found. Around the planet, it's in our soils, our forests, our oceans, deep sea sediments, fossil fuels, and of course, the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. The processes by which carbon moves between these different stocks is called the carbon cycle, and it's been operating by essentially the same principles for millions of years. Luckily for us, about 50% of our emissions are currently absorbed by our ocean and land carbon sinks as part of this natural carbon cycle. But as our environments become increasingly degraded and as our carbon dioxide emissions continue to increase, there's no guarantee that we can continue to rely on these natural carbon sinks to such an extent in the future. I've said that both the ocean and land carbon sinks are key parts of this carbon cycle, and I would love to talk about both, but just for tonight, for the purposes of tonight, I'm going to focus on the land carbon sink. which absorbs about 25% of our global emissions. I'm going to get even more specific than that, and I'm actually going to focus on forests because they are my personal passion. It's what I'm really interested in. I'd like to say at this point that the land carbon sink actually has the largest uncertainty of the numbers in our estimates of where global carbon is. Although we know by simple addition how much carbon is being absorbed by our terrestrial habitats, there's still actually a surprising degree of uncertainty in how much carbon is being absorbed exactly where within the planet, where's it going, and what regulates the carbon cycle at an ecosystem level. So let's have a look at a simple representation of the land carbon cycle. Here we go. So the bubbles that I'm going to put up are in proportion to the amounts of carbon in these different places, and the numbers are gigatons of carbon for those of you who are interested. So firstly, up in the atmosphere, we've got about 750 gigatons of carbon. Mostly is carbon dioxide, some methane as well. Now the land carbon sink, 2,260 gigatons in the vegetation above ground and of course in the soils below ground. There's actually more carbon in soils below than above ground. And it's immediately obvious how much more carbon is below than it is in our land carbon sink than is in the atmosphere. Carbon moves between these stocks, that's a carbon cycle. Every year, forests, which hold about a third of our terrestrial carbon, every year these forests absorb through photosynthesis about 121 gigatons of carbon. But what not everyone always thinks of is they also emit carbon, about 120 gigatons of carbon through the reverse process of photosynthesis, which is respiration, breathing out. Notice that we currently think that our forests globally are absorbing a little bit more carbon than they release, but it's actually only a small net gain. So how do these numbers stack up against what humans are doing? Well, there's an additional store of carbon in fossil fuels deep below the ground, the remains of once living organisms that over millions of years have become compressed into fossil fuels, primarily coal. Before humans came along, this huge store of carbon was essentially locked away and couldn't enter the atmosphere and contribute to a changing climate. However, in the last few hundred years, we've started digging it up and burning it, which releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Every year, humans are currently releasing about 10 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere, largely through burning fossil fuels, but also through deforestation, which is a key contributor to our emissions. This means that how we decide to use our land is crucial to our climate change mitigation efforts. Although this little red 10 gigaton bubble is the smallest in my diagram, that should not make us complacent. Liberating even this relatively small amount of carbon dioxide is already having measurable impacts on our climate, as Mike will say in a moment. Given the magnitude of the other stocks and fluxes that I've shown you in this diagram, it's absolutely vital not only that we protect the ecosystems that currently absorb so much of our emissions, but also that we increase our understanding of how the absorption and release of carbon are regulated. Of course, we know the basics. Plants, like this ash tree seedling, absorb carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, using that in their leaves. Some of that carbon is used for plant growth, and some is breathed out by the breathed out by the plant through respiration. And of course, the soil that plants are growing in is, as I've already said, a major carbon stock, but it's also a carbon source. The soil is absolutely chock full of fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates that are breaking down dead organic matter. Think of leaves, twigs, fruit, bits of dead animal parts, roots, and so on. And just like plants and humans, these decomposer organisms in the soil are releasing carbon dioxide as a byproduct of respiration. And I'm sure everyone in this room can understand intuitively that temperature and moisture are key regulators of both this photosynthesis, this absorbing of carbon, and respiration. How much water is available to a plant and the temperature that it's growing in are going to influence how quickly it grows. Temperature and moisture also influence how active these soil decomposer organisms are, which translates into how much carbon dioxide they produce. So that's quite simple, but when we scale it up to complex ecosystems with hundreds or even thousands of species of plants and animals in them, it's much harder to understand and predict how changes in these systems will influence carbon stocks and fluxes. In general, a healthy forest is going to absorb a bit more carbon than it releases, but extreme stress, such as an outbreak of disease or a drought, can slow down tree growth so that a forest actually releases more carbon than it absorbs. Now that we know the basics of carbon cycling, let's think about our own carbon stores here in the UK. Across the UK, about 12% of our land is forest. Before humans came along, we had about 85% forest cover, but through agriculture, road building, urbanisation, we've destroyed vast swathes of forest, leaving behind this spattering that you can see of small isolated fragments. Not only do we now have a lot less forest cover than we used to, but due to the small size of these remaining patches of forest, they're subject to what we term edge effects. Sunlight, wind and rain can penetrate the forest edge, creating a warmer and drier microclimate. Sorry, I've just seen 4 minutes. I'm speaking really slowly. Right. Problem. Right, speed it up, speed it up. Okay. Forest edges are warmer and drier. Thus, we know that woodland within 50 to 100 metres of the forest edge is much more vulnerable to climate change, as research in our carbon cycling research project at White & Woods has found. But let's not forget that forests are about far more than the carbon stored in them. They're vital to biodiversity. They provide us with food, fuel, timber and medicines. They provide us with clean air and oxygen, and of course, give us amazing spaces for recreation and reconnecting with nature. We really need to manage these systems effectively. They're delicate machines. We don't know what exactly will happen if we tinker with them. So we need to plan carefully when we're managing them and even expanding them, especially in the UK, where we expect such a small portion of our land to provide us with so many benefits. We need to ensure that our terrestrial ecosystems continue to be carbon sinks rather than sources. There's a real need to move quickly to understand the relationships between climate change and carbon cycling in our natural environments so that we can minimise the damage to our essential carbon-absorbing ecosystems. And this is where you guys can all get involved, through citizen science. Citizen science occurs when scientists see knowledge gaps that they can't fill alone, when they enlist members of the public who often have no qualifications beyond an enthusiasm to get involved, to take an active part in data collection to address pressing research questions. Some specific suggestions of projects you can get involved in include a couple of tree health projects that I'll mention. These get individuals on the ground to track the spread of diseases threatening two of our most important tree species in the UK. So Conquer Tree Science tracks the spread of the horse chestnut leaf miner, and the Living Ash Project, which follows ash dieback. Let's not underestimate the threat of these diseases. In countries where ash dieback has already taken hold, there's been as much as 90% dieback of ash. Ash is one of our most common species in the UK, so if we get ash dieback seriously here, we're really looking at a complete change to our forests. We just don't know what's going to happen. A better knowledge of these diseases helps scientists and land managers to develop and implement strategies that can minimise the damage or spread of such diseases, ultimately protecting forest health and function, including their carbon-absorbing capacity. So the Living Ash Project is, of course, the ash dieback tracking citizen science app that I mentioned. And you can also go a step further and get your hands dirty by joining us on our Earthwatch project in White & Woods, which, as I said, investigates impacts of climate change on carbon cycling in our fragmented forests. Each of these projects that I've mentioned up here contribute important, meaningful data that helps us to understand and ultimately protect our forest carbon sinks. There are also changes we should be making at a government level. In the UK, our governments have recognised the importance of forests and climate change through policies not just to protect our existing forests, but to expand them. In England, we currently have about 10% forest cover, and government policy aims to extend this to 12% by 2060. Trees live for decades and often centuries, so it's essential that new forests are planned carefully to ensure their success in the future. Shockingly, 75% of our woodland in England is within 100 metres of the forest edge. We can't afford to ignore edge effects on our forests. I'd like to see the government extend current guidelines to minimise edge effects on newly planted woodlands so that not more than 50% of our new woodland is within 100 metres of a forest edge, where we have this warmer, drier microclimate that we already know has influenced carbon cycling. This will help us to protect carbon cycling as our climate changes. So now to summarise, be quick. So now to summarise, our natural carbon sinks absorb 50% of our emissions. Just imagine how hard we'd have to work to slow down climate change if we lost the carbon absorbing powers of our natural sinks. I've used forests as an example tonight and shown how you as individuals can get involved in protecting our precious British woodlands through citizen science, and how our governments can help ensure future forest health through research-informed planning of new forests. Our forests, grasslands and oceans are not nice to have greenwash hippie extras. They're the basic framework underpinning the planet we live on, and we simply cannot afford to not to protect them in our fight against climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Martha, for that reminder of the fact that we're embedded in a carbon cycle. It's complicated. It's going between the atmosphere, the land and the vegetation. I do wonder, however, whether those two ash trees you brought with you, whether it might be too late for them already. It looks like they might have ash dieback. Do they?
They don't have ash dieback, but I don't think we should rely on them for...
No.
They're not allowed to...
Need quite a few of those to deal with a coal-fired power station. But nonetheless, vital in the overall picture. And indeed, I was at a meeting today where government ministers came together to look at the options on forestry going towards COP21, and one of the figures that was being talked about there, adding up the effects of deforestation plus the potential in terms of restoration of degraded forests, could be something like 1/3 of the total solution globally. So absolutely a huge part of the equation, and one that is very much neglected. So last but not least, in terms of our four presenters, I'm now delighted to introduce Dr. Mike Moorcroft. So Mike is a principal specialist in climate change at Natural England. His role covers both the development of science and its application in conservation. Mike is a senior visiting research associate at Oxford University's Environmental Change Institute. I dare say, therefore, he knows Martha. He's chair of the Climate Change Ecology Group and also led the development of a new high-level report on the impacts of climate change on UK biodiversity. Mike, please.
Thank you. So I'm going to be pitching to you that you should be voting for building ecological resilience, by which I'm particularly going to focus on restoring natural processes and also nurturing your ecological processes in your own backyard, your garden, your neighborhood, your window box. We'll come on to that. Britain's biodiversity is changing. It's changing because of climate change, and it will change more in future. I can say that with confidence, not just because I've studied that kind of thing, but as a result of this report that I had the privilege to chair the production of, working with 40 or more experts in the field. And we all agreed that that was our bottom line message. Change is happening. It's happening now, and more is coming. Let me give you two examples. Species are on the move. Here's one, the long-winged conehead cricket, kind of nice, not perhaps the most cuddly in the world, but all part of our valuable, wonderful biodiversity. What you need to understand here is that when you look up here on the map, see those yellow squares there, just kind of clinging on to the bottom of southern England? That's where this creature used to be prior to 1980. The rest it's spread to in the subsequent decades. I could have put a similar graph up for literally hundreds of other species. Species are moving northwards. And across the whole range of all those different species, warming temperatures are the only sensible explanation that could explain all of them. Sea level's rising, and our coastline is changing, it's eroding. Our coastline's always changing, but that steady rise of sea level, accelerating rise of sea level, is having a profound effect. This is the car park at Salthouse on the North Norfolk coast. Well, actually, it used to be the car park at Salt House on the Norfolk coast. The Shingle Ridge, which runs along the coast at that point, moved inland by tens of meters during the winter before last, during the very major storm events that we had. And it's not going back where it came from. It's on the march inland. And you can see it's not just taking car parks, it's also taking the freshwater wetlands that lie behind it there, important locations for many bird species. So change is happening, and there's a threat to our wildlife and our habitats and our landscapes. But if we work to restore natural processes, we can help nature to adapt, and we can also help people to adapt to a changing climate at the same time. Let me tell you more. Our natural habitats in the UK are extraordinarily fragmented. Martha's already done the warm-up act for me on that one. I don't need to dwell on that. But not only is that a problem for the integrity of woodlands, it's also a problem for species on the move, on that great march northwards. Finding a new home was never more difficult than when it's spaced out at miles apart, if you're a little conehead cricket or whatever. So if we were to have larger areas of semi-natural habitat, and this is a good example of a large area of semi-natural habitat, Morehouse and Upper Teesdale National Nature Reserve in the North Pennines, there is a much better chance of species being able to move to find a place which is locally suitable, perhaps on a north-facing slope or on the top of a mountain or a hill, and also simply to do that business of tracking where suitable climate space is. And this isn't purely hypothetical. At that very same nature reserve, on the Upper Teesdale part of it, this gentian is really a relic of the last ice age, hanging on by its, I was going to say its fingertips, but you know what I mean, by its root tips, on the southern range margin, where it's really too warm. But because of a suitable local microclimate, good land management, low intensity land management over many years, it can survive. So there is hope. There is hope for our species to hang on, at least in moderate levels of climate change. Sir John Norton chaired a review a few years ago now called Making Space for Nature. And that review came to the conclusion that we needed more, bigger, better, and joined wildlife sites, conservation sites. And that's something that if we can do that, if we can put that restoration in place, will allow species to move more easily. Won't allow all of them to, but some it will. And it will allow things to hang on much better. It will allow natural processes to operate. I want to highlight the word bigger in that bigger blocks of habitat are good. This does chime with what Martha was saying. But we've recently got some really good evidence that actually species living in large blocks of habitats are more resilient to some of the extreme events that climate change are likely to throw at our natural environment, particularly droughts. This speckled wood butterfly and a number of other butterfly species are very sensitive to drought. Their populations are knocked back by a drought, a hot, dry summer. But we found, working with colleagues at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, that the populations recover much better when they're in large blocks of habitat. So again, restoring nature allows it to adapt much better. Another example of restoration, not so pretty, or is it? Blanket bog. Wonderful habitat, I would say. You may not want to get up close and personal with sphagnum, but give it a go if you get the chance. Wonderful world there. Sphagnum's brilliant from all sorts of points of view. It traps water, it builds up carbon. Our biggest natural carbon stores are in the peat underneath these wetland communities in the UK. But they are more vulnerable when they've been dried and burnt and overgrazed, as many have been. This is an example, actually, of where if you look very carefully, you can see just a little mound there. Not much to look at, but it's blocking a drainage ditch. That's holding back the water, it's re-wetting the peat, it's restarting natural processes, and it's going to make that habitat so much more resilient to climate change. Good for biodiversity, good for the carbon, good for people. You can do a similar thing on the coast. I've already mentioned, we have an eroding coastline. This is a brilliant example of taking the initiative. Again, it's not a glamorous picture, is it? It kind of looks like a building site. Ah, it is. But this is a building site with a difference. This is Wallasey Island on the Essex coast, where the RSPB, working with Crossrail and a number of other partners, have created a new intertidal wetland. That's creating new habitat. It's working with the grain of nature to allow new habitat to form, to allow those natural processes to happen. And that also helps to create natural flood risk management for people as well, created in the right place. We do a similar thing on river systems. This is the Holnicker estate, owned by the National Trust in Somerset. It's the story of the Somerset floods that wasn't told anywhere near enough. This isn't on the levels. This is quite different. This is on the edge of Exmoor. But huge amounts of work on the catchment there allowed flooding to take place in places where it wouldn't be in people's homes, but it would be in the natural environment where it wouldn't do harm to people, and it might actually do some benefit for nature. It's a good example. Those houses downstream of that area of wet grassland didn't flood during that extremely wet winter of 2 years ago. Can work. Benefits for wildlife, benefits for people, making both more resilient to a changing climate. I'm touching on themes others have touched on. That's good though, isn't it? This is London. It's a heat map of London. You can see different colours. It's hot June day in 2011. The red bits are the hot bits. They're the tarmac, they're the concrete. The cool bits, the yellow and green bits, they're the parks, the green space. Again, we can benefit nature and we can benefit people. It's a natural process again, evapotranspiration, the loss of water from leaves and from soil, having a cooling effect. Letting natural processes to work with us rather than against us. So this is a challenge, I think. It's a challenge for government, yes, for organisations like mine, Natural England, but not just for us alone. We will never crack that problem. Never mind the fact that there's no money, as we all know, in the public sector. We have to work together to get the win-win situations. Good for nature, good for people, good for different people. And I think it's also so important that it comes home to us, to you and to me. What are you doing for nature and for working with the grain of nature in your backyard? A garden, lovely if you have it, even if you don't, in your local area. So don't tarmac your front garden to make room for your car. Sell the car, buy a bike. Sarah would agree, I know. I have a car, I'm afraid, but I have a front garden too. But more important than that, it's also about making a habitat for us and for our children. This is my son a few years ago. He's 12 now. And we're looking at frog spawn. And for about the same length of time, I've been talking about building a pond in our back garden. I haven't done that yet. Now, he's old enough to start helping me dig that, so I think it's about time we got on with it. And I think it's time we got on with it as a society, with all of us playing our part, if we don't engage a new generation with love of nature at that small scale, I don't believe we will ever, as a human race, progress towards sustainability. So, vote for restoring natural processes. Good for nature, good for us, good for the economy, good for reducing emissions, good for climate smart cities, and good for your soul. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Mike. I was delighted to hear finally a mention of blanket bogs, an ecosystem that I've spent quite a lot of time in over the years and have written about, and as you say, bringing these multiple benefits: carbon capture, water storage, flood reduction, and also incredible places to be able to go and renew one's connections with nature. And I think the idea of bigger, better, more connected natural areas is definitely something that should be and increasingly is at the heart of the climate change debate. And in fact, what you've just heard this evening, I think really just takes us all very much to the front line of where this discussion has been going in recent times, and I think sets up very nicely the conversation we can now have over questions and debate before we come to the vote, because we've heard about the opportunity for green growth through harnessing that weightless knowledge by changing expectations, engaging with psychology, believing that we can actually do something. Is that really a big part of the problem? A lot of people believe not only that the science is in doubt, they believe we can't do anything about it. So flicking that psychological switch and moving us into a better place clearly is something we have to consider. We've heard about cities. More than 1/2 of the global population now lives in urban areas. In this country, it's 82%. By 2050, it's going to be between 2/3 and 3/4 of the world will be in urban areas. What do we do about that? Because when people go to cities, they consume more, the economy is bigger, they use up more natural resources. Surely that's the place we have to focus. Or is it on those incredibly important carbon sinks, those places where nature is doing a big part of the job for nothing, and in the process delivering all of these co-benefits: conservation of biodiversity, recreational opportunities? Or indeed, as we just heard from Mike, is this about rebuilding nature and the reconnection of areas of habitat in order to be able to create resilience and opportunities for adaptation? You're going to be voting on all of that at the end of the evening, but first is now your opportunity to interrogate the presenters and to ask them any tricky questions you may have, or indeed to agree with them. We're going to take one question at a time, just to keep the thing rolling along. I'd invite you please to be brief. If you could focus your question to one person, that would be marvellous, just so that we can keep the pace going. I think if we try to get every question answered by all of the panel, we won't use our time very effectively. So let's just really try to think who we'd like to answer what. And there are 2 roving microphones. If people would like to indicate if they'd like to ask a question, we can direct a microphone to them. Gentleman right here, please. Thank you. And if anybody is out there watching on streaming devices, then do tweet. We'll take a few twittered questions during the course of the evening. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the speakers. I've got a very simple question. None of you have mentioned population. From my point of view, that's a major problem with what we're trying to discuss this evening.
Okay. Well, since that was directed at none of the panel, I'll have a go at that one. Incredibly important part of the equation, rising human numbers, but of course, impossible to extract from the question of consumption patterns. And so all of us living in the UK have got a carbon footprint something like 100 times bigger than people living in Africa. If you look at where the population growth is taking place, it tends to be in the developing countries, and therefore when you invoke the population question, inevitably we're talking about numbers growing in nations with quite a small footprint. Of course, their footprint is growing as we go forward, so we do have to think about ways in which it might be possible to reduce that pace of growth. 2 things come onto the table immediately when you start to look at it like that. Number one, and this is what the evidence says, is we can invite people to have fewer children. They generally don't listen. What does work, however, is to enable young women to have education in particular, and then they have lower fertility because they have a better job, they tend to look after their children better, health indicators go up, family income goes up. It's a win-win-win-win-win. If you were the World Bank, you probably would say, if you want to deal with global sustainability, spend all of your money on primary, secondary, and tertiary education for young women in developing countries. That would be thing number one. Thing number two, for those of us getting on, is to recognize that a big component of population growth right now is people not dying anymore. And 2/3 of the people who've ever reached 65 in human history are alive today. This is an incredibly important statistic when one starts to talk about population. Of course, that is a great triumph, as is the healthcare breakthroughs and nutritional breakthroughs that have enabled our population to balloon so quickly. But inevitably, it's raising pressure at the other end of the democratic spectrum, away not so much on birth rates, but death rates. And on that one, I don't think anyone would advocate terminating people's lives any earlier. So it's up there with inviting people to have fewer children. It's quite a hard one. So what I would say is let's all consume less, let's go green, and let's invest in education. Next question. Gentleman over here. Please, sir.
To some extent, you've all been preaching to the converted here, largely.
We'll find out.
We have just re-elected a government, one of whose planks during re-election was cut the green crap.
Yes.
So and we're stuck with them for 5 years and probably for 10, since there's no visible opposition at the moment. How do we turn that one around? If we're talking about the medium term in this country, that is what we have to do. So how do we turn that one around?
I guess this maybe naturally this goes to Dimitri in the sense of our government doesn't believe. What would you say about this political situation we're facing? And by the way, speak for yourself when you say you voted for them.
I'm not giving that one away. A poison chalice, if ever there was one. Okay, let me try as hard as I can to sort of be neutral and objective on this. It certainly is the case that the UK policy landscape that the government inherited was very uneven. Okay, there was so many overlapping policies, it was a little bit of a mess. So for example, electricity, which we wanted to encourage, has an implicit carbon price of about £80 per tonne of carbon. Coal and gas, if you use them directly, have a carbon price, which, coal in particular is horrible stuff, but you don't want to encourage move from electricity to gas either, has a carbon price implicitly of around £2 per tonne of carbon. That makes no sense. And the reason you've ended up with that is because you've had these incremental changes and additions to policy, and you've ended up with this kind of messy landscape. So what does the government do? It comes in and it says, okay, we need a reset. Fine. So it's taken out a lot of the bits that made the policy landscape uneven, including a lot of the subsidies for renewables, and it's done something which is frankly rather weird. It's extended the climate change levy to renewables, which stops it being a climate change levy, but anyway, it's an energy levy. And we're now waiting with bated breath to see what they're going to do to fill the hole. Because as it currently stands, there's no hope in hell of us meeting our pre-stated climate change targets as set out by the Climate Change Act and the Climate Change Committee, which led to Lord Debon, the chair of the Climate Change Committee, a former Tory, David Gummer, who you may remember eating a burger 10, 20 years ago in the context of foot and mouth disease, but probably best we don't mention that. Nevertheless, he wrote a letter to Amber Rudd, the Environment Secretary, asking her to clarify the direction of government policy. So that shows you, to some extent, the degree to which all sides of this debate that favour a clear and credible signal on climate are feeling rather desperate and bereft. That's about as positive and optimistic as I can be, except to say that, supposedly we're waiting for the positive side of this story, or the kind of, what's going to replace the stuff that's been taken away.
Thank you.
Watch space.
So I'm looking for anybody who's not a man with a hand up over here, please. I can't actually see. Is that right? Yes, thank you. I can't actually see from here. There's too many lights coming this direction. Maybe someone in the balcony next, and then we'll have a Twitter question. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
This is a question for Sarah. How do you feel about the effect of the urbanization of the human population? I know that in the United States, there's been quite a movement trying to get everybody to move into cities and leave the countryside alone so that it can do what Mike wants it to do and expand its environments and so forth. And just thinking back in, I think in 1850, was the point at which 50% of the population of England was living in urban circumstances. And that was the point at which people began to regard nature and the natural world, to regard nature and the natural world as something precious rather than something to be purely exploited and not to be, just there forever. So how do you feel about the role that increasing urbanization will have in getting people to think differently?
There's quite poor acoustics, so I wasn't 100% sure of the question. So let me restate that and make sure I'm on track. My understanding of that question was, will urbanization change the way people engage with the environment for good or for bad? Is that a fair statement? Was that the question?
And also the question, how does it help the environment?
Urbanization has the potential to be hugely good for the environment, particularly from a climate aspect. When people are living densely together, you can provide services in a much more efficient way. So things like water, energy, transport can all be provided much more efficiently with much smaller carbon footprints. It's just that, as Tony has flagged earlier, people who come to cities tend also to be richer, and so they'll consume more as well. And then cities are poorly designed so that when you travel around cities, that it's done in very inefficient ways. So in places like Copenhagen, Oslo, Amsterdam, and actually in London, people have a much smaller carbon footprint than the national average. It's just that it could be much smaller again if we get the design right. So there is hope, but it's quite difficult to do.
And I guess we'd point to the benefits of green space in cities for reasons that were pointed out earlier from Mike in terms of temperature amelioration, but also from the point of view of connecting people in urban areas with nature, which appears to be really quite an important part of how we remain healthy. So lots to be said about that, but given the direction of travel of the world, it looks like we're going to have to think hard about how these cities of the future are going to accommodate all of these different questions. So we have a microphone down here, please. Front, Crispin, would you like to share a thought or two?
Thank you. I have 2 points I wanted to make. The first relates to what Dimitri told us. Thank you very much, but I think I was rather uneasy at the way in which you use the word growth. It's a word much beloved of politicians, and it's not a good idea to increase growth itself. What you need is different ways of measuring the ways in which our economy works. And I think there's nothing which is more important at the moment than to redo the thinking about economic measurements. So I'd just like your comments on that. And the second point I was going to make was that when we try and convey the message to people, I've always found that the best and most effective way is to be able to demonstrate the interest of each person, organization, company, government, whatever it is, in change. And so you have somehow to locate and identify how each country or whatever it is may in fact benefit from the kind of things that we've been talking about. And I don't think it's too difficult. It's quite interesting to see, if you look across the whole spectrum, really from the individual to anyone else, it's quite easy to see how you can in fact take advantage of it to do things better and to improve your own standard of living and your own activities generally. So I'd just like a comment on that, because I think it's a very important way, part of the process of thinking differently.
Thank you. Any volunteers on the panel, or should I allocate it? You're looking like you might have to go, Martha. Sorry, Dimitri, you go. And then
no, the growth, because I was named, so I thought I ought to say something.
Actually, yes, no, you're quite right. You did say it as well. But she's talking about trees growing, which I suppose is slightly different, but still. Sorry, you go ahead.
I don't want to say if someone else does it. On the growth, you're absolutely right. I mean, growth is a very narrow measure. It measures some activity in the form of output. There's a whole lot of activity it doesn't measure, including output that's undertaken in the home, for example, often by unpaid women. There's an awful lot that it's a measure of flows. It's not a measure of stocks. So if you have an earthquake, during a recession and you destroy, as you had in Japan in Kobe in the mid-90s, for example, and then you have reconstruction, that boosts growth. That's not to say we want more earthquakes. And it's a very utilitarian measure. It doesn't measure things like individual rights and freedoms, things that you and I care about, but aren't within, and policymakers ought to champion, but aren't captured in growth. So you're absolutely right. It's a partial measure. It does, however, have one strong advantage, and that is it's a known quantity and it's universally comparable across countries. So my response is to say you're absolutely, we should not focus just on growth, even though, as I say, it is correlated with some things we want. And in some parts of the world, growth in incomes really does matter for half of the world in a very kind of direct life threat, life order of magnitude sense if you're in poverty. But that we should look at a whole spectrum, a dashboard, if you like, of indicators we care about, including the environment, including human attainment, including human rights, and so on and so forth. But growth should be in that dashboard. But I think you're right, there is excessive obsession in growth. But to the extent that we can solve some of these problems and grow, I think we need to at least recognize that and staunch the discussion. Because if it's set, if this is all couched in terms of costs and sacrifice, we're not going to get anywhere. And if the truth happens to be that you can achieve a lot of the change that you and I want without much cost and sacrifice, then unless you're a diehard Puritan, I think politically that case needs to be made because you're much more likely to garner political traction and find a way forward.
Thank you. I see a hand over here on the corner, thank you. And I'm going to ask whoever's looking at Twitter to get us ready for a question or two in a moment. Is anyone actually looking at Twitter? Yes, thank you, good. We'll come up there in a second. We'll have this question and answer first. So maybe if you could select one or two that you think might spice things up, that would be marvellous, please.
Hey, good evening. Obviously tonight we're talking about choices that have to be made and how we prioritise. Now what we know from looking at things like abatement curves is that in fact we have to do everything, but even at the left-hand edge of an abatement curve, even what you might call the positive territory, we don't get the things done that should be cost positive. They should just happen. So I've got a question that's really for all of the panel to answer, which is that in your respective fields, what do you think are the quickest, easiest wins? In the big game of pool, what's the first shot you could take that you would advise us or the organisations we work for to do in our lives to move this process forwards, please?
Okay, we're going to go for just one panelist, however, just for the sake of keeping things moving. Martha, you have a go because you've not had a chance to reply to any of the questions yet.
Right, so we're asking what one recommendation would be. Sorry?
Quickest, easiest thing you prioritise. Well, you've already said it, obviously,
well,
making woodlands bigger. Still, something else.
Stop chopping forests down. Easier said than done, but I mean, that would be, if you could wave a magic wand and stop chopping forests down, as Tony said, about 30, we've got the potential to suck up about 30% of our carbon emissions just with forests through avoiding deforestation. And of course, avoiding deforestation as well as stopping climate change also has huge benefits for development, as we've been talking about all the other all the ecosystem services that forests deliver. So I would stop deforestation somehow.
Thank you very much, very clear. So what's Twitter saying? Do you have a microphone?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, Ian has asked a question for Dimitri. He asks, are there benefits in alternative economic models based on well-being and happiness versus economic growth?
Thank you. So alternative economic ideas based upon well-being and happiness rather than growth in GDP. Mike, do you think about that ever in terms of the work you do? I guess if you're looking at people's quality of life and access to nature, maybe this touches on some of your thinking.
So certainly I have colleagues who do, and interestingly, our economist, our principal economist in Natural England, Tim Sunderland, a great guy, is actually one of the most eloquent speakers on other ways of valuing nature. And, you know, value, there are many different dimensions to value. Value is a useful word, but it doesn't just have to be financial. I'm sure the financial will remain important, but we have to get get better at evaluating the full worth of nature. And I think our national accounts would look very different if we did.
Indeed, if one starts to subtract even the economic value of destroyed rainforest and drained blanket bog and depleted soils, and if you start to put that against GDP growth, we actually find we're not growing anymore. Yeah. Quite a powerful way into getting alternative takes on what GDP actually means. So did we see a hand over right, a sea of hands? Let's have the woman on the second from the end there, please.
Hi there. This is a question to the economists, so to Sarah and Dimitri. It seemed as though there was an emphasis on mistrust of the private sector and also the government. So, while I think it's a really great idea that we should be getting everyone involved and everyone should be able to do their bit, surely we can't sort of undermine the role of the private sector. The private sector investment and investment generally in clean energy grew 68.5% between 2009 and 2014, according to statistics tracked by Clean Energy Pipeline. And so far in 2015, $222 billion has been invested in clean energy globally. So what can people do and what can businesses do to really encourage and stimulate further investment from the private sector? Does it rely entirely on policy, or is there anything else that can be done to keep that growing?
Okay, do you want to look at that?
Yeah, I mean, great question. You see, the problem is this is a very policy and regulation-led sector, and one of the reasons that's the case is because there's a lot of damages being done, which isn't captured in either the pricing that we look at or the assessment of value in GDP that we look at. So if you don't price this stuff and if you don't value it, and it's not just climate pollution, it's urban pollution, it's congestion, it's energy security, it's a whole host of things that aren't being priced. And also research and innovation, by the way, has spillovers that are free. So the private sector will always tend to under-provide innovation if it can't recoup the rent. That's why patenting was invented, but it's not sufficient. So it requires intervention. And it requires policy in order to set a clear signal so that the private sector can invest knowing it's going to make a return. And the worst thing you can do to put off private investors who are itching, I mean, there are entrepreneurs and innovators out there itching to transform the economy and just waiting for the opportunity to do that. The worst thing you can do is tinker with your policy, send mixed and muddled signals so they don't know whether from one year to the next, and certainly over the investment span of their capital, which could be decades, whether you're going to just pull the policy rug from underneath them. We need consistency and we need credibility.
Thank you. Where did I see a hand a moment ago? Right there, please, in the middle, at the back, and then we'll go to the gentleman over there afterwards. Can you get the microphone down there? Thanks.
Hi there. I know obviously this evening is very much about Britain's, what can we do domestically? But I wondered in the context of the run-up to the Paris talks later in November and December, what you think the role that British can play kind of on the international scene, and to what extent it's important and possible for our voice to be heard on the international stage. So I'm not sure who that's directed at.
Any volunteers from the panel?
I can say something. Obviously, my role is almost entirely English-based officially, but I was invited to go to Brazil, which was great. But it was really interesting meeting people from Brazil and the government agencies there, that actually a lot of what we've done here, because we've almost got a model system, our little country, we can start to be a world leader in the understanding of how to make things work, be they in adaptation, which is a lot of what I do, or in mitigation technology. So I think there's a leading by example, certainly, a lot of technology transfer, knowledge exchange, sharing what we can learn here, which it's that much harder in some of these other countries to take those first steps.
I think it's fair to say that in the wake of the policy choices taken since May, that quite a few people are concerned that Britain's leadership role is rapidly receding with the scrapping of the low carbon buildings programme, end of the zero carbon home scheme, withdrawal of incentives across the piece on renewable energy, engine standards on vehicles being rolled back, It's not a positive signal coming from the UK to the rest of the world. Happily, however, other countries are going in the other direction. President Obama's intervention recently has taken the United States from being a laggard to being a leader. Change of administrations in Australia and Canada show that things can alter very quickly. And so the thing that keeps me optimistic is that despite Britain's go slow, the rest of the world is going very fast. And actually, it might be good for British ministers to spot that and wish to keep up rather than being left behind, would be my personal view. Gentleman there, please.
I'd like to go back to Dimitri's for a moment. I'd like to make a positive point, an optimistic point. There's a technology side of things. The renewable technologies, wind and solar particularly, have been growing exponentially for the last several decades. So, for example, solar started in the 1980s, I think, and has been growing exponentially ever since that time, with various fluctuations up and down depending on the oil price. And it's been doubling with a doubling time of approximately 18 months, 2 years.
Yes.
And all we have to do is look ahead a few more years. And it's very obvious that it's going to be a dominant technology. So I think everybody worries too much, thinks that they have to do too much to make things happen. And actually, if you just almost sit back and wait, it's just going to happen. So the question for Dimitris is, where does policy come into that? Is it just about enabling it to happen without putting too many blocks in the way?
Who'd like to have a go at that? Who hasn't said anything for a bit? Martha or Sarah, would you like to have a go at the role of policy and renewables? Do you think about that in relation to cities or trees?
Policy has been invaluable in the role of renewables. It's by setting quotas, by providing subsidies, it's made the transformation possible. I wholly agree. I think something that Dimitri was saying, although I'm aware that I was quite harsh to him in terms of picking a priority, I think he was wholly right when he said that a critical part was having this wide framework of long-term commitments. And the UK has done that more than most countries with its commitment to an 80% emission reductions by 2050. Making sure those policies are across a wide range of sectors and at a whole range of levels of government is so important to maintaining the transformation, because it is going to be a transformation beyond just the energy sector. Sorry, temporarily lost my train of thought when I had a rush of fury again at the recent abolition of renewable subsidies. I was just getting excited about putting all of my savings into solar or something like that. And I shouldn't be angry, but to illustrate the importance of that long-term commitment, I come from Australia, and we have seen policy flip-flopping backwards and forwards so much in the last 6 years, and it's an embarrassment, but it's also completely undermined any kind of private sector engagement, which came up earlier. And so policy has to be at the forefront, but also people's demand will shape policy. People voting, people calling, people writing to their MPs, people investing themselves. So I hope I answered your question. As I said before, the acoustics aren't amazing here, so I missed some key words possibly.
Can I just add, it's a lovely optimistic thought, and I wish it were true. Unfortunately, it's not what the markets are saying. If you look at valuations of oil companies and fossil fuel companies, if even a fraction of what oil and coal companies are valued as, and national oil companies, national coal companies are valued as having in their reserves, were to be burnt. Pretty much you want only 30% of coal to be burnt, more than 50% of oil and something like 70% of gas, and we will blow our carbon targets. So most of this stuff has to stay in the ground. The markets are saying that at least twice as much, enough to fry the planet, is going to be burnt and is in the valuation of these companies. So the markets don't yet believe that renewables are going to do it on their own. We really do need a strong policy signal. And that's why, coming back to priorities, you can build the smartest cities in the world and do the best things in the world for forests. But if you're building 4 gigaton power stations based on coal across the world, you can absolutely kiss the planet goodbye.
Thank you very much. So microphone over there, please, gentleman at the back, and then we're going to go over here, but we'll go there first. So gentleman with his hand up in the middle there. Chap with the microphone's disappeared, but maybe he's going to come back again. There he is. Look, there we are.
Thank you very much.
Go ahead.
Yes. Sorry, on the political front, we were talking about governments not sort of getting in on the act, on the Green Act, and despite sort of greenwash, etc., doing nothing in particular. But I was thinking more of the vast majority of the population. How many millions of people in this country actually couldn't care less, I mean, are totally indifferent to these issues we've been discussing tonight. Well, I don't know, have you got any stats on this? If you do sort of polls on whether people really care at all. And secondly, I mean, how do we change their habits? How do we change our own habits and other people's habits who belong to that group I've just described? Because we've got to do that, because if we change our habits and change our attitudes, then governments have to follow us. We are the drivers, you know. The consumer, if you like, is the driver. And nobody seems to make this point enough. Now, why do we have advertisements for cars all the time? The car culture, why is it thrown at us all the time? No alternative, doesn't seem to be an alternative to this in the media. It's car culture everywhere. Just an example of that kind of culture. Buying cars, all the rest of it. Now, how do we change people's habits and attitudes quickly? It's got to be done quite quickly. Sorry.
Thank you. Well, we're kind of back in, aren't we, to this conundrum of the relationship between the private sector, regulators, and individual consumers, and navigating that space. And one of the things I would say that might be quite interesting to look at, and I'm sure nobody will, is the role of advertising and the extent to which preferences are shaped by very clever psychologists inserting ideas into people's brains that they may not have had were it not for the very clever advertising. So if there's something that can be done there with some kind of partnership between people designing ads, companies, and maybe regulators, I don't know. But certainly it seems to me that a lot of our culture is shaped by things that are being sent to us by ever more powerful media, wherever they're coming, through a phone, television, side of a bus, whatever it is. It's all very calculated to create a certain view, and that view is not necessarily a low carbon friendly one. However, just think what could be done if that incredible sophistication of communications could be brought to bear in building consensus about the solutions for this. It could be very quick indeed. So,
sorry, that seems that people have to be led. I mean, we're not particularly led by anything, are we?
no, but being given good information is often quite hard. Anyone on the panel like to come back on this? Culture, car culture, consumers? Please, Martha, go ahead.
Yeah, I can't remember whose quote it is, but someone said, every pound you spend is a vote for the kind of world that you want to live in. And I mean, that's quite obvious. That's what we've been saying, that consumers have to make these choices. But how do we change these choices? I mean, I don't know from a policy level, but I mean, certainly, I think what I would say is leading by example, getting into schools, working with young people, getting things ingrained in people, I think, from an early age. I certainly remember when I was young, people didn't wear seatbelts. I grew up wearing seatbelts, and I can't imagine a world without seatbelts. And the same with recycling. When I was a kid, it was quite unusual to recycle bottles. But through education programs in schools and so on, that just became the norm. And that isn't necessarily something quick, but I think it's something that is really important, is first, it's living the life that you want by making these important decisions on a daily basis, and living the life that you want to lead, and also making sure that what we want is well communicated. I think particularly to kids, I really do think that's absolutely key, is understanding the power that we have as individuals, not just through spending. Yeah. And also, it's like, we talk about, what's policy doing? Well, we've got people here, like Natural England. I know that Natural England doesn't create policy, but the big organisations that create policy, that's a group of individuals. Our politicians are individuals. And I think someone said about, sort of lobby, do write to your MPs, do get involved in your local nature group, because we can't sit back and wait for other people to do things. It's us taking individual action for the kind of world that we want to live in.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Microphone over there, front row on that segment, thank you.
Thanks. My comment's really just to follow on from a few that just came before that, and it's about messaging around climate change. And I think actually there's been a bit of a con of the public in recent years in personalising climate change. It's every individual's fault. So you're the agent of your own destruction because you use too much plastic bags, you drive too much, you eat too much meat. And for me, that's an incredibly disempowering message. And it's just pretending that individuals are the cause of climate change. And even a cursory look at the statistics shows you that actually on the individual level, it isn't really. individuals that are emitting the most. It's things far out of their control. And if we continue down this route of saying, use less plastic bags, you're the agent of your own destruction, I think it's a very alienating message. So how do we turn that around to actually empower individuals to actually create a system in which they can live a sustainable life? Because I think it's almost impossible in our current systems that we live under to do so.
Indeed. We'd like to have a crack at that. We're a bit disempowered by the system and individual behaviour is always going to be limited.
I think there's two ways to look at that. The first is that the very messages you offered as examples could all be turned around to make the messages about individuals. Eating vegetarian once a week reduces your footprint. Make a difference, have a Neapolitan pasta, whatever it might be. Have a stir fry, they're great. I think the second aspect is following on from what Martha was saying, that individuals can call for change, but we actually can't necessarily make a lot of that substantive change ourselves. As someone said earlier, you might want to cycle to work or catch the bus, but if you live in some of the far outlying suburbs, you can't do that. You will need it to drive to get around. And so there's a major role for government and the private sector to play in setting up the infrastructure, setting up the institutions, and they will do that if we call for it. So it is a bit of a chicken and egg problem, but it could also become a virtuous cycle, as we've seen in a lot of northern continental Europe, where people constantly demand higher green standards and the government constantly raises the bar again for them. So that's something to strive for and to work towards.
Thank you. Where do I see a hand next? Oh, we have some more coming in on Twitter. Let's have another one.
Bex asks, what about climate emigration, people moving from areas at high risk of climate change to developed cities with higher consumption?
Sorry, say it again a bit louder.
Okay. What about climate emigration, people moving from areas at high risk of climate change to cities with higher consumption?
Okay, so people being driven out of rural areas effectively into cities because of climate change impacts. Who'd like to have a go at that? Mike, has your work ever taken you into these kinds of questions of human migration? No. More cricket migration. Important though that is. Well, I can tell you one thing, the person who's tweeted there, some emerging research looking at the origins of the conflict in Syria, and suggestions from some climatologists that a long-term drought in the Eastern Mediterranean was one of the triggers that led that country down the path it's now gone down. And this was caused by rural-urban migration because people's crops died and their animals died, and they were forced to move to the cities, where they finished up in a position of conflict with the existing urban dwellers. That sowed the seeds for revolution, which led to the position we're in now. No one would say that this was the only cause, alongside poor governance, lack of democracy, poor natural resource management. But already, I think, the academics would tell us that we're already witnessing the beginning of this, because the chances of the drought, the severity of that drought, it was never something that's been recorded before. It was off the instrumental record. It was highly consistent with the East Mediterranean climate change models, and the climatologists believed that the chances of that occurring by chance were about 3 to 1. So if that drought was linked with climate change, it was a 3 to 1 chance it was, i.e. 3 times more likely than it occurring naturally. And that led to this migration that then led to these series of consequences. So that is something that's already out there, and people are documenting this. I know that the rainfall patterns in East Africa are changing. Many of the people we're finding coming to Europe at the moment from that part of the world. And so maybe we're already beginning to see some of these connections. And then people, of course, they're moving to cities, not only in situations that are conflicted, but also to places where they can make a living and earn better income. And undoubtedly, the failure of agriculture in many parts of the world is going to make that go more quickly. So there is a big linkage there. And, you know, the more we interrogate this subject, the more we find these linkages, some of which are quite unexpected. So who would like to ask a question? Woman at the back there, please. I've got a microphone over there. Put your hand up again. Yeah, you, that's it. There we are. Go ahead.
Hi, this is for Martha. In terms of carbon sinks, how do you see their role from a longer term perspective? Because to me, the oceans are a major carbon sink, but they're already showing signs of stress in terms of the pressure that's being put on them at the moment. And in terms of planting forests, there's going to be a limit as to how much we can do to expand the forests in this country. So, once those steps have been taken, how do you see that having a major impact going forwards?
Okay, very good. Thank you. Martha, go ahead.
Oops, sorry. Right, okay, so what role do our natural carbon sinks have in the future? Well, as I've said, about 50% of our emissions are currently absorbed by carbon sinks. That's the ocean and the land. And you're right that, as the ocean warms, it's going to have less of a capacity to absorb carbon. And if forests, if we don't look after our forests, then they do have the potential to not only stop absorbing that much carbon, but also to actually become carbon sources. So we've seen this happen in the Amazon already. We had 2 droughts in the last decade, which influenced the Amazon to such an extent that the Amazon rainforest as a whole, as trees started dying back, the Amazon rainforest actually started emitting more carbon than it absorbed. We can't afford to let that happen. And I think there is a lot that we can do to protect forests and other natural carbon sinks, of course. But I do see, I think it's more obvious to me how we protect land carbon sinks than ocean sinks. Personally, I know more about the land. So protecting forests through sensible planting, through trying to stop their over-exploitation and degradation, through minimising forest fires, if at all possible. Like in Indonesia at the moment, forest fires are 60% of Indonesia's emissions are from forest fires. It's terrifying. Yeah. So if we can protect our forests more, then that's fantastic. But the other thing is, of course, how we use the rest of the land, how we farm and so on. I think there's a lot of potential to change farming systems as well as forestry to ensure that we keep all of that carbon in the soil. That's total land carbon sink, but thousands of gigatons of carbon in our soil. We can't afford to let that get into the atmosphere. And through looking after existing ecosystems and through careful management of agriculture, I think there is a lot we can do to make sure that they not just continue at the moment, but there definitely is the potential to expand their absorbing capacities, or at least keep it where it is at the moment.
Okay, we've got time for one last question, I'm afraid, before we're going to go to the vote. Gentleman down here, please. If we could get a microphone into the middle there, that would be great. There will be time afterwards in the bar to continue the conversation, so we're not finishing the evening with the end of proceedings in here. But I'm afraid time marches on, so we're going to have this one last question, then we're going to do the voting, which will be great fun. Go ahead.
Andrew Ross from Global Garden. I'd like to put a positive spin on this. The global financial industry really does get this story. Over $100 billion have been invested in green bonds this year, and the market is desperate for projects. What's needed is to bring these together using natural capital accounting to scale up to a system that the market will invest in. The money's there in its squillions. Where are the projects?
Thank you. Mike, natural capital accounting must have come across your desk at Natural England.
Yeah, we're very interested in all of that. I mean, just one example, the peatland code, to become something I talked about, is an initiative to bring in corporate financing for peatland restoration for the benefits that it brings. We could also talk about the forest carbon code, but I think there is an opportunity there. And I always feel slightly awkward at some of these sort of events, because, I work for the government ultimately, so, you can't say anything terribly controversial. But, you have to work with what's there. And there are some initiatives. So you have to stay positive and you have to look for those opportunities. And so I think that's a great note to finish on, and I think let's all go away and look what the opportunities are for each of us this evening, I think. Indeed. And it will be different for everybody.
Thanks, Mike. And that is a very positive note in which to enter the vote, because this subject obviously isn't standing still, and some good things are happening alongside some of the other challenges we've heard about this evening. So I'm going to now ask for the voting slide to be put up onto the screen. There it is. You have four choices. You've heard the arguments laid out in the brief conversations earlier and in the Q&A that's followed since. Which government action would you most like to see implemented? Transforming the economy, credible, clear policy framework, a part of that. Creating climate smart cities and those lovely places we might like to live with cleaner air and more livability. Safeguarding carbon sinks, that huge body of organic carbon out there, which is also the home to the world's biodiversity. And what about building ecological resilience? So harnessing some of that at the same time as building our capacity to cope with inevitable climate change. So I'm going to take these in order. It's going to be a simple show of hands, and it's going to be down to me to guess what is the upshot. We haven't got time to count. Please go ahead. You may. Well, the credible bit might be a bit worrisome. No. We would assume that in the country where this would be implemented, that there would actually be clear and credible policies rather than the claim of. Thank you. Right. Can we please have then those who would vote for actual clear and credible policies? Please raise your hand. Right, okay. I need some kind of election observers with me here to make sure this is done properly. Okay, quite a lot. Right. Creating climate smart cities. Also quite a lot, but maybe not quite as many. Not quite as many. Okay, safeguarding carbon sinks. Quite a few there, but not so much as the other two yet. You can only put one hand up. I think I can't see you from here. You're not wrong, actually. Building ecological resilience. Okay, thank you. Well, we have support for all of the positions, but I think Dimitri, by dint of making it about everything, has actually won the vote. Congratulations. Okay, we're not quite finished yet. Can we have the second slide, please? Because we're now going to ask you which individual action you are most likely to adopt, and in relation to those same headings. So, transforming the economy. Would you act to change social norms, show leadership through being a voter and making consumer choices? We've heard a lot about that this evening. We're all active and powerful citizens, should we wish to use our influence in that way. So, would we go there? Creating climate smart cities, investing in efficient homes, and I would add cycle routes. I would say also about parks and places that are helping to mitigate the effects of climate change in terms of being able to adapt better. Safeguarding carbon sinks, would we want to get knowledgeable about that, join a citizen science project? And building ecological resilience, becoming active very locally in restoring that green infrastructure that is not only so important for wildlife, but for all of us. So here we go again. And actually what I'm going to do this time, I'm going to go from the bottom up, see if that makes a difference. Right, so building ecological resilience. Who would like to vote for that? Well, we've got a good bit of support for building ecological resilience. Thank you. Safeguarding carbon sinks. Yep, nice bit of support for that too. Creating climate smart cities. Yes, we like that quite a bit. And transforming the economy. Yes, I think we like that a bit more. So I think we're concluding from this evening that the economic agenda and being active citizens to shape that really is something we can see the sense of, but bear in mind, of course, that all of the other things actually are a part of that. So even though the argument went that way, I think we're saying that all of this is important, and I think that's a very strong message to take away from this evening. So it just remains for me just to basically make a few closing remarks before thanking our speakers and thanking all of you for coming this evening and participating and engaging so enthusiastically with the discussion. I think just having listened to tonight's debate and having been involved in these questions for really quite a few years now, I think, you know, we really have turned a corner in this country and many others where we're no longer really debating if we have a problem. We're really now debating what are we going to do about it. And that's why this evening's conversation, I think, is really so important in giving us the opportunity just to sit back a little bit, hear some of the arguments from the experts, and just to be reflecting on where we might take this debate as individuals, as we just said at the end there, in terms of how we're going to influence the future of this conversation. And I suppose one thing I'd say as well, by way of broad reflection, is how we're just reminded tonight, as we are at every turn, how this is not an environmental issue. It is a major economic question. It's a social challenge in terms of the places we want to live, and even in relation to the demographies of our societies, bringing in questions like population. It's also a big issue in terms of how we measure the success of societies and whether this metric of growth that we have is actually the right one. And as we reflect on all of that and think about what we're going to do, and just bearing in mind how we voted just now, maybe one of the things we need to add to being active voters and active consumers is to also be the agents of engagement, because not everybody yet is really fully involved in this conversation. And if we are going to get to where we're going to need to get to, we're going to have to elevate the profile of this in society. And I think one of the things that I take from this evening, which I think is really quite spot on, comes from Crispin here, who's a very long standing advocate on all of these questions, who says, you know, what's the interest? And I think that's absolutely vital to understand what is the interest, because not all of us are ecologists, and not all of us are going out there and looking at the phenomenon and documenting it and everything else, or trying to design policy. A lot of people feel quite remote from all of this. And so perhaps maybe we might wish to reflect on the power of speaking about clean air, as we've heard in relation to cities. Very much the same things needed to make the air clean as to cut carbon. What about personal fitness and getting on your bike and walking as a personal benefit rather than something you're doing to save the planet? What about having nice places to live where you really want to be, because it's green and beautiful with bird songs and water and all the carbon being soaked up by those ecosystems that you're living by? And then what about the opportunities for the private sector in being able to come forward with new products, to engage with consumers in new ways, to be looking like part of the solution rather than a fossilized company that is part of the problem? Opening new markets, building new technology platforms, going into the future with optimism and being something that society will value. Which company wouldn't want to be like that? So there's real interest there. And then I'm kind of brought back to the point we just made there about the need to transform the economy, and perhaps some of the conversations that need to happen with governments around the world, including our own, and the interest they might have in being more attentive to this. And perhaps the interest we need to be pointing out to Her Majesty's government right now is the potential to create jobs in low carbon technologies, to create a more socially inclusive society by making people's homes more energy efficient and their food healthier. Being able to compete in the emerging markets of the future. We've heard about the dramatic scale of increase in renewable energy. We're taking ourselves out of that picture right now in order to go for oil and gas. These are not the competitive industries of the future. They're literally fossil industries that are dying. Technology, every country wants to be at the forefront of that. Going for fossil fuels isn't really part of that agenda. And if we wish to drive investment into the United Kingdom economy, we need to be sending the signals that are going to be attracting the companies that are going to deliver all of that high-tech, efficient, modern technologies that will put this country at the forefront of the change that inevitably is coming. And I feel particularly confident in saying all of that because some people who I don't always naturally agree with, including the director of the CBI, says pretty much the same thing. So this is not really any longer, I would say, about Greens versus the rest of society. It's about understanding that we all have an interest in this. And I would encourage all of you this evening, leaving here with these marvelous insights we've had from our panelists, to go away and to share that and to engage people and to let them see that they have an interest too. So finally, can I just thank our fantastic contributors, Dimitri, Sarah, Martha, and Mike, who's given us so much food for thought. Thank you all very much. You can get a drink in the bar by going through that door or that door. Please do carry on the conversation, and not just tonight, but for the years ahead, because we really need it to get deeper and go further much more quickly. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Having said that,